Story 1. Fear can cover ground pretty fast. Let me tell you about the most terrifying experience I've ever had. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me, the wilderness, and a well-earned break from everyday life. I'd been walking most of the morning, deep into the woods, looking for that perfect spot to set up camp. That's when I crossed paths with him, this guy with hardly any gear, which was the first red flag out there in the middle of nowhere. There was something about his eyes, a glazed-over look, like he wasn't all there. I tried to be friendly, just a nod as I passed, but he returned it with a stare that put me on edge. I kept walking, trying to shake off the unease as I listened to his footsteps heading the other way. But then they stopped. I glanced back, and there he was, standing dead center on the trail, just staring at me. It was like one of those moments in a horror flick where everything goes silent. He must have realized I caught him because he spun around and carried on like nothing happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something incredibly off about the guy. The further I walked, the stronger that feeling got. Call it instincts or paranoia or whatever, but I decided to trust it. I veered off the trail, found a thick patch of brush, and waited. Sure enough, about 5 minutes later, I saw him hustling down the path, moving fast in the direction I would have been walking. My heart was pounding in my chest. This guy was looking for me. I stayed hidden, taking shallow breaths and trying to remain as quiet as possible. Eventually, he came back into view, walking the other way. I waited, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, making sure he was long gone before I even thought about getting back on that trail. Continuing on, I walked with a brisk pace, trying to put the encounter behind me. Maybe he was lost and was just going to ask for directions, I told myself, deep down inside knowing that that probably wasn't true. I'd walked for quite a while and finally decided to get a camp going. The sun was getting low, so I found a spot and set up my tent. Settling into sleep, I'd mostly put the encounter behind me. I remember thinking I'd outwalked the fear, but it turns out fear can cover ground pretty fast when it wants to. Waking up in the dead of night is disorienting at the best of times, but when you wake to a sound that shouldn't be there, it's downright terrifying. There was a loud sound coming from just outside my tent door. It was rhythmic and deep. At first I was frozen in place trying to place the sound. I'd heard it a million times before. I knew I had. But when it's right outside your tent, in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, common sounds can be hard to place. Mustering the strength to investigate, I slowly and quietly stood up and unzipped my tent to get a look. What I saw shot panic into every cell of my body. There, on the ground, just a few feet away from the entrance to my tent, was the creepy man from the trail. He was in a deep sleep, the sound of his rhythmic snoring echoing through the dark forest. My heart was in my mouth, pounding against my teeth. I couldn't stay there. In my panic, and not quite in my right mind, I made a split decision. I threw on my shoes, my shirt and pants, and slipped out of the tent, zipping it up behind me. I fled into the trees once more. I hadn't really thought the plan through. I guess in my panic, I just wanted to get as far away from the creep as quickly as possible without him noticing. I left my bag, flashlight, cell phone, and just about everything else inside the tent. Not that it mattered. I was out in the middle of nowhere, and there was no way that I'd get any type of signal to make a call. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first light filtered through the branches, I saw him wake. He was disoriented at first, but then he stood and examined my tent. His movements were slow and quiet, like he was trying not to wake me. As I watched from a distance, he did something I'll never forget. He sniffed my tent. Not just a casual smell. It was like he was trying to fill his lungs with my scent. It was then I knew I wasn't dealing with a regular person. Fear had me in a grip I've never felt before, and it was squeezing tight. He started looking around, probably thinking I was still in the tent. I remember as he slowly began to wander off, leaving his stuff behind. For what purpose, I couldn't tell you. My best guess is that maybe he went to relieve himself. It was then that I seized my chance. I quickly and quietly made my way back, grabbed my backpack, zipped the tent back up, and left it behind. As I put a good bit of distance between us, I could hear the creepy man in the distance, shouting, filled with rage or frustration, or both. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Reaching my car was like finding an oasis in the desert. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the authorities. They searched, but they never found him. No trace, like he was a ghost. But I know he was real. They did find something else, though. My tent and the few items I left inside it. It was destroyed. The most terrifying part? It was slashed apart. Every piece of canvas was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. That trip was meant to be a break from the real world, but it ended up being anything but. I often think about what in the world that guy was up to. Why was he following me? Why in the hell did he sniff my tent? And what was he shouting out after he found out I had flown the coop? People often tell stories of encounters with bears or mountain lions or even wild hogs. For me, though, the most terrifying thing I can possibly think to encounter again in the woods walks on two legs. Story 2. Which way did they go? You know how you look back on some memories, and they're like snapshots, crisp and clear, like they just happened yesterday? That's how I remember that weekend. My best friend Mark and I, we had this tradition since forever, heading out into the wild, just us and the essentials. When he called me up and said, "Hey, let's do the forest thing this weekend," I didn't think twice. We'd always loved the way the forest could drown out the chaos from the world. As kids, it was our adventure land. As adults, it became our retreat. We packed our tents, sleeping bags, and lots of dry food and snacks, along with plenty of water. That's all we needed. The drive up was the same as it always had been, full of dumb jokes and the kind of deep conversations that only seem to happen when you're on the road. We parked, walked, and reached our usual spot by the afternoon. It was a cozy little nook by a stream, far enough from the beaten path to feel like we had the whole forest to ourselves. We pitched our tents, got a fire going, and settled in. The hours slipped by with the crackle of the fire and the sounds of the water. Just a couple of guys catching up on life. It was great. Waking up the next morning, we packed up after some campfire coffee and headed out. Mark wanted to check out another spot, a few miles off, down an old logging road that wasn't much more than a dirt track by then. Walking down that road felt good, stretching the legs, breathing in nature's air. As we walked, we stumbled upon this old truck, off to the side, on the shoulder. We couldn't tell how long it had been there, but something in my gut told me that it hadn't been there long. As we walked on, our blissful weekend took a turn. We could see someone in the distance. It wasn't until we got closer that we could begin to make out details. He was shirtless, which was weird because there was a cool bite to the air. More alarming, though, he was mumbling and gesturing his arms erratically, lost in his own world. As we cautiously walked within a few feet of the man, his eyes glared over at us. It was disturbing, the way he seemed so disconnected from everything, except for us. Our best guess was that the man was on some type of drugs, which was terrifying, because here we were, out in the middle of nowhere, with someone that was off his rocker. We kept our distance, and our eyes, on the individual as we picked up the pace. But as we thought that we were in the clear, the sound of someone yelling made us stop dead in our tracks. It was this guttural shout, full of anger and something else. Mark and I felt like we were in a compromised position. We were caught between a crazed lunatic on, well, something, and an intimidating voice coming from a distance around a bend in the road. The yelling guy was calling for the shirtless man, and it was clear that he was angry. Mark looked at me, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. While the lunatic was distracted, caught up in his own world, and before the angry man, having not yet seen us, could make his way around the bend, we nipped off the road and into the underbrush, putting as much of the dense forest between us and them as possible. We found a spot to hide, crouching down among the ferns and fallen leaves, our hearts thudding in our chests. The voices were getting closer. We could make out bits and pieces. The angry guy was now talking to the shirtless man. They were having some sort of argument. Then we heard it, clear as a bell. Which way did they go? They were looking for us. Why, I couldn't tell you. But right then, it didn't matter. We felt like we were the prey in a hunt we didn't understand. "You know what happens if we get caught, right?" the angry voice said. "Find them. Now." All thoughts of camping, of another night under the stars, vanished. It was about survival now. We waited, barely breathing, and watched. "We gotta go," Mark said to me. He was right. Having disappeared between the lunatic and the angry man, and with the other side of the road having a very steep incline, there's only one place we could have gone: into the woods. If we stayed, we were almost sure to be found. Before the men could make their way into the woods, we moved back, slowly and quietly. No trails, no noise, just as much distance as we could, as quickly as we could. The farther we got, the more quickly we moved, until we were off in a dead sprint. When the car finally came into view, it was like a beacon of civilization calling us back from the edge. We didn't bother with packing things neatly. We just threw everything into the trunk and got the hell out of there. The city never looked so good, with its loud streets and crowded sidewalks. I'll never take the city for granted ever again. I often reflect back on that weekend with so many questions. What were the men doing? What were they hiding? What if we had ventured a little bit further and seen something that we shouldn't have? What would have happened to us then? Maybe it's best not to know. Sometimes, I guess, you stumble into the wild. Other times, the wild finds you. Story 3. Game Cam Terror. Ever since I was a kid, I've had this thing for the woods. It's like stepping into a different realm where the rules of the city don't apply. You can breathe out there. So when life's noise got too loud, I'd pack up and head out to this spot I found years back. It's out past the edge of a cell signal, where the stress of life can't reach you. This time, I was off for a 3-nighter. The drive up was therapeutic, just me and the summer breeze blowing into the cabin of my truck. When I turned off onto the dirt road that snaked its way into the heart of the forest, I could almost feel everyday life shedding from my skin. I got to my spot in the late afternoon. It's a little clearing, surrounded by old pines. The first task was setting up the tent, a ritual that would lay my claim to the land for a couple of days. But as I staked it down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was already something different about this trip. I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to catch a glimpse of something, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet woods and the occasional bird call. I tried to busy myself, gathering wood for the fire, laying out my sleeping setup, doing all those little camp chores that help you settle in. But it was like there was static in the air, a charge that made my skin tingle. When night fell, every crack of a branch had me jolting upright, straining my ears for any sound out of place. It was weird, because I'd never been this way out here before. I've always been a rational guy. I don't spook easy, but this was different. This feeling, this sense that I wasn't alone, gnawed at me through the night, a persistent dread that I couldn't let go of. Come morning, I was bleary-eyed from lack of sleep. The uneasy feeling I had was still there, though. Feeling that I needed to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I remembered the game camera I'd tossed in with my gear. I brought it on a whim, thinking it might be cool to catch some wildlife shots. But now, it had a new purpose. I set it up on a tree with a good view of my tent, thinking it'd act like a security camera. I'd see that there was nothing there but me, and finally be able to get some peace. The day passed slow. I tried to fish in the nearby stream and read some of the book I'd brought along, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing back to that camera, like it held the answer to a question I hadn't asked. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I felt that unease intensifying. Nevertheless, I ate my dinner and settled into a book by the campfire. That night was worse than the first. Every sound seemed magnified. I felt like I was hearing footsteps, but played it off as just something in my mind. I lay there in the dark, thinking of the camera, of what it might be seeing while I tried to fall asleep. At first light, I was out of the tent and at the camera. I told myself to be ready for a laugh, for the sight of a raccoon's curious face or a herd of deer standing in the distance. But when I flicked through the photos in the little 2-inch LCD screen, the fear that had gripped me all weekend was validated. There was a man, not just passing by, but standing there, stock still, looking right at my tent. It was the middle of the night. The timestamps read between 2:04 and 2:18 a.m. For 14 minutes the stranger stood and stared at my tent. It gave me chills just thinking that a thin slice of canvas was all that stood between me and this individual as I slept. Terror has sharp teeth that can clamp down on you, like a shark in the water. My trip was over, my 3-nighter having just turned into a 2-nighter. I threw everything into the back of the truck. The tent, half collapsed, my sleeping bag a tangled mess. It didn't matter. I was done, and I was leaving. The trees blurred past, a green tunnel that seemed to tighten around me as I drove. I reported it to the rangers, even showing them the photos on my game cam. They took it seriously, promised to look into it, but what could they do? The woods are vast, and a man like that, a ghost in the night, he wouldn't be found if he didn't want to be. He didn't steal anything that I knew of, and I wasn't assaulted in any way. But still, I felt like my space and my peace of mind were violated. It's been a while since that trip, and I'll be honest, it's been a while since I've been in the woods. The gear is still in my garage, picking up a little bit of dust. Someday I'll go back, I tell myself, but not just yet.